Well, I can see that we are full house, so we'll start. Before I request Ambassador Kishan Rana to chair this afternoon's seminar, I wanted to welcome all of you, and especially warm welcome to Mr. Avtar Singh Bhasin and a very distinguished panel, Ambassador Shamsharan, Ambassador Kishan Rana, Ambassador Menon. The panel that we have itself reflects a kind of a special occasion we have this afternoon. For me personally, I can tell you that I have been a major beneficiary of Mr. Bhasin's very prolific and remarkable scholarship. During my early assignments in Nepal and Sri Lanka, I made it a point to ensure that his documentary studies on Nepal and Sri Lanka were literally kept within my reach in my office. And Mr. Bhasin, if you are going to institute an award for most frequent reader of your volumes, I'll be a serious contender. And the latest, the 5-volume documentary study on India-China relations, which has just come out, it's already within my reach in my office. And I have no doubt that I'll benefit immensely from that. So thank you very much for the kind of work you have done. And I'd like to thank our panelists for coming here. And I'm sure we'll have a very stimulating conversation this afternoon. So I'll request Ambassador Rana to chair the session.
Thank you very much, Ashok. Friends, first of all, my warmest thanks to the Indian Council of World Affairs, the Institute of Chinese Studies, Avtar Singh Bhasin, who is the instigator of today's event, if one can say that, and of course all of you for coming. Let me confine myself to one major point, but first a few words about Mr. Bhasin. Bhasin Sahab and I worked closely together from about 1973 onwards, when I joined the Northern Division, and he was an officer on special duty and essentially the pillar on whom rested the entire desk work, management and detailed work in relation both to Nepal affairs and our actions in looking after His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We have spent many mornings and afternoons together narrating to each other stories about the Dalai Lama's impish humor and his penchant for taking people by surprise, but that's another story altogether. This particular collection owes to a tremendous amount of effort that Avtar Singh Bhasin has put in mobilizing, sourcing material from a huge number of sources. I know that as Foreign Secretary, Ambassador Shivshankar Menon played a key role in helping him in putting together an even more massive collection of 10 volumes on Pakistan. But in many ways, I guess from an official perspective, the Pakistan collection was a little easier to handle than, say, the China collection, if only because much of the information, much of the data relating to the very early part of the India-China contacts, conversations, still remain sensitive and still remain, in a sense, behind closed, locked cupboards. So putting together this collection was a heroic task, really, on the part of Mr. Bhasin. a collection of 5,700 odd pages cannot be summed up in one event, in one statement. I will be delighted to see how the two panelists, the two very distinguished former foreign secretaries, Shah and Shankar, handle the task of presenting a kind of, synopsis, personal perspective of this collection. And I want to really say that a lot of people in India and outside owe Bhasin Sahab a huge debt of gratitude for the extraordinary work that he has done in putting together this collection. I hope you join me in applauding Bhasin Sahab. I want to just pick on one event that's covered in these volumes. Mostly in volume 2, but a little bit in volume 1 as well. And that is the negotiations that led to the 1954 agreement on India-China agreement on the Tibet region. This was the first major India-China negotiation. And many narratives relating to that are very much part of common knowledge. So let me throw light on or approach that negotiation from another perspective. The Ministry of External Affairs produced a note, a fairly comprehensive note, on the strategy for the talks. That note is part of the collection. And of course, with any collection of documents, we must remember that what we get are usually an end product, a document that sums up an event, an episode, a perspective. It may be a telegram, it may be a note, it may be a letter or a commentary. But we don't have the whole trail of documentation. That's rarely available. I think in the India-Pakistan series, there is perhaps more of that than there is in the India-China series. So we don't know everything that went on behind the scene in, say, the framing of that note on strategy. But candidly speaking, one is struck by the fact that there is a stark absence of a strategic perspective in that note. And in fact, a strategic perspective anywhere on the Indian side. And we don't have Chinese documents, so we have no idea what went on in Beijing, in the Foreign Ministry and elsewhere. We have really no evidence of strategic thinking. After all, what was at stake was the transition of a set of colonial-era arrangements of a time dating to a time when neither India nor China were autonomous, independent, liberated entities, and shifting them to a new era where the two countries were independent actors in their own right. And that meant that it's almost as if we did not apply our minds to the shift in the relationship that would take place. We did. There are lots of statements where we say that we know that things have changed, conditions have changed, Tibet is now under China's control. But we still haggled on a whole series of points that related to a colonial trail, where perhaps boldly it might have been possible for independent India to draw a line and say at the outset that we don't want any part of this. But we didn't do that. The consequence was that a 2-week, what both sides thought might be a 2-week negotiation, became hard fought, hard drawn, day-to-day encounter, almost 4 months of negotiations. Where in the end, we conceded almost everything that China wanted, because China was clearly asserting, as frankly any country would have in those circumstances, that none of the old arrangements could subsist any longer. So, a skeleton of the old arrangements remained for a while, and the agreement stipulates that those arrangements worked out in the 54 treaty had a life of 8 years. And there was no mention of an extension of that period. It is, of course, a huge, huge irony that those 8 years did terminate in 1962, when a whole series of events made everything pertaining to those kind of inherited British colonial era arrangements irrelevant, totally irrelevant. The other thing that is missing, if you look at a major negotiation from a negotiation theory or negotiation doctrine perspective, is that we didn't really set out either our list of the essentials that we had to hold on to, and we didn't at all consider what China would demand at the negotiations. I don't think any of the documents, and certainly the ministry's note, says very little about what would be the Chinese position in these negotiations. And surely that is a fairly major issue. And then, of course, there is the very big issue of whether the issue of the border should be raised or not raised, on which there were two competing narratives within the Indian establishment which were jockeying for attention. And one of them was pursued by G.S. Bajpai and others, which dated back to Sardar Patel, that we should explicitly, directly take up the border issue. And there was the other narrative which spoke of don't touch it with a barge pole kind of theory. The MEA note, I think it is of December 1953, suggested that we could perhaps in an opening statement mention that we are happy that there are no border disputes, or that there are no territorial issues between the two countries. But even that was dropped on the premise that India should not talk about the border. India should not talk about territorial issues. Because if we did, by even mentioning it, we would open the Pandora's box and China would jump in with territorial claims. Did this suggest a total confidence by India in its own border position? I don't quite think so, because there is a telegram, part of the collection, which mentions actually, looking so far ahead, it mentions that perhaps in the Aksai Chin, perhaps in the Ladakh region, Aksai Chin and some other territorial points could be conceded as part of an overall settlement. But that again is one of those rare references that appears and disappears before you can even notice that it was there. So I'll stop there. All I want to stress is that there is a wealth of material in these 5 volumes. And a lot of researchers, a lot of PhD candidates will, not just in India, perhaps around the world, will be using this as vital material that throws new light, additional light on a very complicated issue. I'll stop here. If you permit, Shankar, we will begin with Bhasin Saab, of course, and after Bhasin Saab, perhaps Sham, you might like to say a few words. Your comments as the discussant, as the speaker on this occasion, followed by Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon. The floor is yours, Bhasin Saab.
Thank you very much, sir. You were very, very generous in taking note of my work, and most grateful to you, of course, for the long association and the present one, which I know to cherish. Let me begin formally. Ambassador Comfort, Director of Chinese Studies, Chairman Ambassador Rana, discussants Ambassador Shyam Saran, Ambassador Shankar Menon, ladies and gentlemen. Here I would like to take particular note of presence of Avtar Singh, who was instrumental in making me start this project. Thank you, Sujata. To begin, I will thank Mr. Chinese Studies and the director for arranging this discussion. My grateful thanks to Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon and Shyam Saran for spending valuable time for discussing this book. Thank you, Ambassador Rana, for chairing the meeting. To all those who are present here, ladies and gentlemen, I express my heartfelt thanks. I would like to clarify straight away that I do not intend to go into the substantive part of the book that I am giving to the discussants. I will talk about some peripheral issues which are relevant to the present project. The 5-volume study containing 2,500 documents and running into more than 5,500 pages, which is now before you, took me more than 4 years to complete. I do hope that these documents would help to see the Sino-Indian relation perspective, since they give clue to how and why the relation between two countries soared. By occupying Tibet in 1951, China for the first time in history became the contiguous neighbor of India. The new China was not only a communist state, but a nationalist to the core, and swore to get back areas over which it perceived Chinese retreat any time in history. The least disappointment in China was its failure to comprehend that Chinese leaders had stormed into power by waging a more than 2-decade-long armed struggle against the rival Kuomintang, and were battle-hardened leaders carrying ranks of marshals and generals who did not fight shy of using military force to achieve their objective fast and quick, then getting involved in long and slow negotiations and making compromises. Let us remember, Mao famously said, power grows out of the barrel of the gun. The present study is my 5th in the series, India's Neighbor, earlier 4 being on relation with Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and Nepal in 5 volumes each, and Pakistan in 10 volumes. I have quite a few more publications to recall, but I think it is not necessary to mention all of them here. I will, however, certainly mention my forthcoming book titled India-Pakistan Neighbors at Odds, which is being published by Bloomsbury. It is based entirely on archival material accessed from the Nehru Papers ME archives, which gives a fresh perspective on old issues. For the present publication, I will mention that when I started on it, I had reasonable assurance from the highest level in the ministry that I would have access to the records in China. Therefore, initially when I was asked to submit the list of files I wanted to access, I became very hopeful. A list of more than 500 files prepared after spending several weeks in the ministry's archives remains frozen there since then. The later part of 2014, access to the Nehru papers was a great moral booster. A look at this paper was enough to convince me that it was a treasure trove opening before me, but it was also a stupendous task staring at me. The Nehru collection ran into 800 volumes. Each volume has 2 parts and some even 3. Each part has about 250 pages, almost forming a bulk of 400,000 pages. These papers are on all sorts of subjects, both domestic and foreign, neither arranged subject-wise nor with an index or a list. I had to physically go to each and every page of this collection to sift the material relevant to my subject, which took more than a year and gave a rich harvest of several thousand pages, which constitute about 2/3 of the present collection. However, I am grateful to the Ministry of External Affairs for financially underwriting this project, since projects like this cannot be completed without institutional support. In the absence of access to the Ministry's records, the present collection does suffer from certain gaps, but I had to make do with what was available. Even then, I can say with confidence that these papers do tell a coherent story, at least until 1962. The policy of the Government of India regarding access to its record is governed by the Public Record Rules 1997, which lays down specific guidelines regarding sensitive papers. It says, records and cartographic records relating to the Ministry of External Affairs and Ministry of Defense, respect of Arunachal Pradesh, including eastern section of the Sino-Indian border, Sikkim, Bhutan, Nepal, Tibet, China and Myanmar, areas comprising Pakistan and Bangladesh, may be made available for consultation, keeping in view the security and defense of India or any part of the territory thereof. Important to note is that there is no blanket ban on their access. The rules only prescribe some caution to be observed in their access, keeping the security angle. But in practice, there is a complete ban on their access. Look at the contradictions. Some senior bureaucrats who held sensitive posts during their career and who had access to sensitive records kept them back at home, and the heirs deposited them in public and private archives, thus negating the so-called sensitivity of the papers. However, I welcome the audacity since it has benefited research and benefited me particularly. In this connection, it is relevant to mention that when I attempted a similar work in Pakistan, Mr. Menon, Foreign Secretary, allowed me full access to the ministry's records on Pakistan and they took full advantage of the facility. These volumes are now in public domain for almost 5 years, and nobody has said that they compromised national security. Thank you, Mr. Menon, once again for your liberal approach. While on the subject of ministerial records, I would like to pay tribute to Ambassador Shyam Saran, who as Foreign Secretary understands the value of records for posterity, not only created the most modern archive for their preservation, but utilized them also. Earlier they were dumped in a dingy room somewhere in the ministry, and in time these papers ran the risk of being lost to posterity. I think the MA needs to look objectively at its policy regarding access to records. With no access, the writers and documentators fall back on secondary sources and present a lopsided picture of the government policies. It is in the ministry's own interest that the records which have ceased to be operationally sensitive and are released periodically, as is done in many countries, for study of its policies in perspective. The present study not only chronicles the post-1947 developments in India-China relations, but as a background reproduces some landmark documents of the early 20th century, access of the National Archives as well. Some documents bearing on the two countries' relations vis-à-vis Nepal and Myanmar too find place in these volumes. The two letters which Ambassador Shyam Saran found in the basement of the embassy in Myanmar, as mentioned in his book, are also there in this collection. Before I end, let me say a few words about the dichotomous policy followed by the British in the early 20th century in relation to Tibet and China, which created problems later. The British, while accepting Tibet as a sovereign and equal in the Shimla Convention, yet continued to insist that Tibet was autonomous under Chinese sovereignty, thereby weakening Tibetan resolve for independence. They catered to Chinese sensitivities while taking advantage of the helplessness of the Tibetans. It is relevant to mention that in the 19th century, the British, desperate to open Tibet for trade, tried their luck through Peking, but the Chinese balked at responding positively, conscious that their word would not be respected in Lhasa. The Tibetans, on their part, had banned entry of any foreigner in the country and ordered their border checkposts to kill any foreigner trying to enter. Given the Chinese option, giving up the Chinese option toward the end of the 19th century, the British used military force to dominate Sikkim and then tried to open Tibet for trade. The Chinese faced a new situation while accepting the de facto position of British in Sikkim, insisted on preservation of the signs of the de jure independence in China. The British found the uncharacteristic situation unacceptable. Forest Secretary Durand observed, if we give way in respect of Sikkim, we must be prepared to do so at some future date, not only with regard to Bhutan and Nepal, but with regard to Kashmir and her feudatories such as Hunza and Nagar, and with regard to smaller Himalayan states which may have committed themselves. We might even have China claiming sovereignty right over Darjeeling and Bhutan duars, which we acquired from her so-called feudatories. Disappointed with the Chinese attitude, the British decided that Tibet must accept the British dominance, failing which they should enforce a settlement on the Tibetan without further reference to China by occupying Chumbi Valley up to Pahadi. This, the Foreign Secretary Durand believed, should suffice to bring the Tibetans to their knees. He said, and I quote, "We should put an end once for all to our troubles with Tibet and to our exclusion from that country, which would then be open to our trade. We should entirely break the influence of Tibetan not only in Sikkim but also in Bhutan, and we should greatly raise our reputation in the Himalayan states." It was finally the Young Husband's expedition 1904 that opened Tibet to British trade, and trade agency was set up. When the British left India in 1947, New Delhi inherited the British position in Tibet and followed the same policy that Tibet was autonomous under Chinese sovereignty. Tibet, taking advantage of civil war in China, expelled the Chinese Amban from Lhasa, and with that they thought they had forever got rid of China overlordship. However, the communist takeover in China in 1949 was a bad omen, which neither Lhasa nor Delhi had seen coming, with all the pernicious consequences for both. Thank you, sir, for your patience and listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Rana. First of all, I would like to pay tribute to Shri Avtar Singh Bhasin for the absolutely monumental work that he has achieved. And I think the value of what he has achieved is something which is going to, I think, be a treasure that we will be turning to again and again in the coming years. It is unusual to have this kind of work done in India, because I always feel that in India history is almost a distraction. We rarely pay the kind of attention that we should to our history. And you mentioned the archives of the Ministry of External Affairs. By the way, when I took over as Foreign Secretary, the historical division, which was one of the most important divisions in the Ministry of External Affairs, had precisely 3 staff members, 1 section officer and 2 assistants. And the archives were, of course, in the palace, as they are called, behind the Ministry of External Affairs. And I still remember the first visit I paid to the archives, and when the ancient lock was opened and I went inside one of the rooms. Literally, I felt like crying, because there were files which were strewn all over the floor. There was seepage from the roof, and some of the files, actually, the papers were all stuck together. You could not even separate them. And it so happened that the very first file which I picked up was really a remarkable document, because this was the account of Prime Minister Nehru's visit to Bhutan in 1958. And Mr. Nehru was, in that sense, a very unusual Prime Minister, because he recorded meticulously every day all the events that took place that particular day. And there were pages after pages of his impressions of the day. For example, his meeting with the Chinese general in Chumbi Valley, and the conversation which took place, which is in some sense hilarious, but at the same time very, very revealing of the Chinese attitude. And the conversations that he had with the third king of Bhutan when he arrived in Bhutan. And there are pages and pages of recording in great detail, what was said by the king, what his response was. It's really a kind of a lesson in realpolitik, the whole conversation that took place. And yet this file was the first file that I picked up from the floor. And when I went through it, I really felt what is the kind of attitude that we display towards our own history. Anyway, as has been pointed out, to the limited extent that was possible, we tried to put those archives in some kind of organized shape. The most important thing that we were able to do was that for about 6 months we had about 50 young IT guys who actually digitized something like 6,000 files. And now virtually all of that is available in digital form, properly recorded. And we also, if Shankar remembers, that we created a room, air-conditioned room, access to computer, where I in fact told all our retired colleagues that here is something to which you have easy access if you wish to. Very few used it. And here is somebody who made use.
It's not so easy.
But despite the fact that there is this resource available, and of course I'm not so sure how up to date we are, but what also surprised me and made me feel a little depressed was that even if there was access to the resource, not much use of that resource was made. And that is, I think, something that we should really reflect upon. I think what Avtar Singh ji has done is to give us really a treasure trove. I do hope that there is use made of it. Not only because there are such fascinating anecdotes here, but for example, there is a record, I think, of the conversation between Mao and Prime Minister Nehru in Beijing when Prime Minister had gone on a visit. And there is an Indian record which I think perhaps was made by the then interpreter Ambassador Archival. I think that he's the one who had made that record. Several years later, I found a record of exactly the same from Chinese sources. And it is fascinating for various reasons, because number one, the Chinese record is more detailed than the Indian record. For example, it also records conversation between, it says, Chairman Mao and Prime Minister Nehru get up from the sofa. This is what it says, the Chinese record. Get up from the sofa and they start walking towards the dining room with the ambassador following behind. And while they are walking to the dining room, this is what Chairman Mao mentions to Prime Minister Nehru. And it says, Prime Minister Nehru does not respond. And this was actually a comment made by Chairman Mao on Tibet, on the situation in Tibet. And Prime Minister Nehru completely ignored it, which in itself is is quite a fascinating incident. So that record has things which are missing from the Indian record, and in a sense it gives you a sense of the atmosphere, which prevailed, during those talks, quite apart from the content itself of the talks. So I think, history is very important because as those who are in the game of statecraft and diplomacy now, if they do not have a historical perspective, you are almost inevitably going to repeat a lot of the mistakes that have been made in the past. Reference has been made to some of the aspects which emerge from the reading of this record, and these are lessons which are very well taken. The importance of, for example, doing your homework. This has always been something that I have learned dealing with the Chinese, how much meticulous homework they do before they come to the negotiating table. If they are not as well prepared as you are, frequently they will stop that negotiation. They will spin it out in some way, but will not get into the nitty-gritty of the negotiation until they go back and come back to if you are better prepared. And it's so important, therefore, to especially in dealing with China, but not only dealing with China, but dealing with any other country, to be really well prepared in terms of our own homework. The other aspect, which also I think Ambassador Rana pointed to, is the whole negotiating process. That I think it is so important that when we go into a negotiating exercise, that we should have a very clear idea of what our bottom line is. What is it that you are aiming for, but what is it that you will not go beyond? Which is the threshold you will not be ready to cross? Because if you have that, then actually you can conduct those negotiations in a coherent manner. What comes out again and again through these volumes is that very frequently we have not had a very clear sense of what is it we want to achieve, what is it that we are ready to give up, what is it that we are simply not willing to cross that threshold at all. That makes all the difference, I think, in terms of negotiating exercise. You must have that band available to you within which you can do the horse trading. It's as important to have that band, because if you do not have that band, what are you going to negotiate? So that's important, but it's extremely important that you have that bottom line, because if you do not, very frequently you have an attrition process at work which becomes open-ended, because you don't know where to stop. Then other dynamic takes in. I cannot go back without an agreement, and that becomes itself a objective, and you don't have a proper substantive objective in front of you. I would certainly like to say that one of the reasons why I think we were successful in a more recent negotiating exercise like the Indo-US nuclear deal was precisely because we were given very, very clear red lines that we were not going to cross. And I think that gave a great deal of confidence to negotiators like us. Perhaps Shankar will talk about his experience, but that was very important, and that is something which comes out very clearly from these volumes. And that is something which I think for the diplomats who are coming into service in their early years, I think this would be a tremendous and very, very valuable lesson. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sham. Just a word, if I may add. That particular incident of the two records, the Indian record and the Chinese record, relating to a very important conversation. It's rare to get access to two parallel records. And that, of course, is very much part of the comparative study of diplomacy, what it involves. In that particular episode, Sham, actually, as they got up and there was a brief reference again to Tibet. Prime Minister Nehru did not respond, but sadly the ambassador did. And some of his comments are extremely not helpful to it, my view. And that is part of the report. It's now comes to. But anyway, these are some of the gems that are contained here. The floor is yours, Chairman.
Thank you. Let me join the others in congratulating Mr. Bhasin on what he's done. More than 5,700 pages, over 2,523 documents. I haven't read them all. Therefore, I'm free to say what I want. But if you want to know where to start, please start with his introduction, 86 pages of his introduction, because he has read them all. And it's an incredible job to actually master so much material and to put it in order and just handling it. I don't know how he did it. But really remarkable work, and it's really something that will be valuable, not just to diplomats, but I think to the lay public as well, because people and researchers and others who have to dip into it. And it's essential work because of the way we treat our official documents, because we are not following our own rules, we're not releasing them after 30 years, and that actually leaves the field free to, well, every Tom, Dick and Harry, or every former Sunday Times correspondent to write what he claims is an authoritative history of the 1962 war based on Delhi dinner table gossip and complete trust in a closed, opaque Chinese system and their motives. I mean, it's incredible. I find it, and there are Indians who actually believe this as the best version of the history. So, unless we put our documents out, we're actually leaving the field free for other people to do it. Now, the argument normally within government is, no, how can we reveal our hand and our thinking, because, the Chinese don't release their documents, so this is very dangerous. Well, as Ambassador Rana said, we have 10 volumes of everything on Pakistan, including the various conversations, Rajiv Gandhi's Yaul Haq, you name it. Did the skies fall? Has anything happened? Nothing. So for me, it's important that you get your version out, and that's why I think we really, the more pressure we can mount on this, the better. As for the substance of what he has revealed here, and for me, just a few general impressions, because each of us will dip into it and find what we want. One very clear sort of takeaway is that the salience of Tibet in the 50s and 60s in India-China relations. And it just runs through almost every document one way or the other. And that centrality, ever since the PLA marched into Tibet, 1950, we became contiguous neighbors for the first time in history. I think it's also clear in the documents that we underestimated that centrality. We meaning India, at least official India. Okay. And it becomes important in different ways, not just as an India-China issue, but as an issue, especially after '59, in creating the public opinion and the mood in Parliament, which then led to the various steps the government of India took, and the inability in 1960, for instance, to come to an agreement. But I think the value of what he has here in terms of documents would be even greater if I think we had something on the Chinese side. And fortunately there is. In Hong Kong, party historians have secretly have been publishing volume after volume of official Politburo history, internal histories. And I've seen, for instance, of the 56, when the Dalai Lama visited, you can now see there's the Indian version of, because Chou Enlai, when the Dalai Lama told us that he didn't want to return, Chou Enlai came running thrice in 3 weeks. He was in Delhi, talked to the Dalai Lama, talked to Panditji, and you have records of Panditji's conversations with both. You have the Indian records, you also have Chinese records, and it's like Rashomon. It's completely different versions of what happened. Of course, ultimately the Dalai Lama chose to go back to be with his people, and in some ways but there are crucial moments like that which I think, thanks to this, there is now also an Indian version available, and that I find is very useful. Because, you know, and I'm amazed actually that we underestimated the Tibet factor, because if you think of it, the People's Republic chose to liberate Tibet first rather than Taiwan, at a time when Acheson had actually withdrawn the military umbrella for both Korea and Taiwan with his statements in public. And Kim Il-sung, of course, immediately used it to try and do what he did in Korea. But the Chinese chose to go into Tibet, not Taiwan. I mean, that for me says something. And yet we didn't quite see how important this was to them. But the records also show that the salience of Tibet and India-China relations then diminishes after the 60s. As both countries grow, as both define their interests in expanding ways, points of contact multiply, the number of issues on the table also grow, the relationship changes, and that is also reflected in the documents that we see here. The other thing that I found interesting is how sensitive, well, I'm judging Chinese by their actions and us by our documents, but how sensitive the Chinese were to the international environment in which they operated. And we don't see the same kind of sensitivity on our side. And the kind of willingness to use moments of opportunity, say the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62, and so on, at each stage of this, and to back off when they see that situation changing as well. When we get to the negotiation of the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement in '93, for instance, the Chinese are operating in a situation where they know they're the last surviving big communist regime, and they think they're the next target for regime change by the US and the West. And for them, that is critical. So they need to put all these relationships, which are difficult, whether Japan, India, Vietnam, all of them back on some kind of track. And they choose to do it in different ways with each one. And it's interesting how, if you look at Chinese commentary throughout that period, it always draws the international context into what we're doing. Ours doesn't. Ours deals with each issue on its own merits, and of course we're always convinced we're right. So but we're happy when we get our way. So we have an interesting picture that emerges. The international situation, Cold War, for instance, made our relationship with China difficult and complicated it. There's no question through the 50s and 60s. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, we probably had a period when the international situation actually helped us to deal with the relationship with China. Now we're back into a situation where the international factors actually don't help the relationship with China. You're being asked by the Chinese and the Americans, choose me, and while they themselves reserve the right to deal with each other. So you're in this peculiar situation, but it's interesting to see this thread running right through the documents. For me, it's also fascinating for what it reveals of Chinese behavior when, I mean, under pressure in '62, internally as well as externally, what the Chinese choose to do with India is not what India expected them to do at all. So for me, I think there are several instances right through this of critical moments in the relationship where China then opts for a much more assertive posture than you would assume would follow from internal pressure and external weakness, which makes you wonder about the kind of assertiveness that you're seeing today by China on the international stage and what the motives behind it really are. Because if judging by the past, all things are open. In any case, this is a book that repays all kinds of study and that I'm sure we will all go back to for many, many years to come. Thank you for having done this, and thank you for having given this to us. There are all kinds of documents here about relationships that are very important to us today. Triangles, for instance, India, Myanmar, China, India, Nepal, China. So for anybody who has not just an academic interest, but even a professional interest, a practitioner's interest, this is really the book for us. Thank you for having given to us.
Shankar, thank you for all the pertinent points that you made. When we celebrate the publication of such a massive compilation, we might also perhaps remember a few others who narrated their own stories. And in the India-China relationship, the one narrative that has not been read with the attention it deserves is P.K. Banerjee's story of his days in China from June of 1961 to December 1963. It was a very strange time. P.K. Banerjee was the number 2 in Tokyo, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, he was told that he would shift to Beijing and take over from Ambassador Arthur Singh, who was being withdrawn. He had a month together with Ambassador Arthur Singh. From that time, he was told that he goes to Beijing, right until December 1962, well after the border war. P.K. Banerjee is not asked to visit Delhi, not once. It defies comprehension how a de facto head of mission could be sent to Beijing without having had any access to talk to anybody in New Delhi about his tasks in China. And the other very strange story, and this comes out in Bhasin Saab's collection of papers also, is that far more than India, far more than India, China has used the Indian envoy in Beijing as a channel of communication, directly carrying messages from Chinese leaders to India. I don't think there is anywhere in the collection any reference to a Chinese ambassador meeting the Indian Prime Minister. There must have been meetings, but no substantive discussions. P.K. Banerjee, in the lead up to the war, between July 61 and October 62, had 6 or 7 substantive meetings with Zhou Enlai. Always with Zhou Enlai. I think one with Chen Yi, and Chen Yi was exceptionally harsh at that meeting. But again, that whole narrative, that story is very, very few remember it. Very few remember that Zhou Enlai sent a so-called secret message through P.K. Banerjee to Panditji, which P.K. Banerjee wrote down in his handwriting and carried it in his wallet till he came to Delhi. And when he reached Delhi, the foreign secretary asked him if he had brought any message from China. And he said no. Because he said, I have been instructed by the Chinese leader to convey this only and personally to Panditji. And so when he does finally meet Panditji, it takes a little time. He hands over that piece of paper, handwritten. And Panditji reads it. According to P.K. Banerjee in his book, it's too late. How can we do this? It's too late. Then at the next meeting, Panditji again pulls out that piece of paper. Obviously, he's carried it somewhere with him or kept it aside. And he burns it in his ashtray. So we have no proof that there was any message. We have no proof that this even happened. I mean, the story is, put it gently, very, very complex and very torturous and screened behind many, many semi-permeable barriers, perhaps. But I also take very much into account Shankar's point that we in India have grossly underestimated the importance of Tibet in the relationship, particularly in the earlier years, but I would dare say perhaps even right up to today. I slightly disagree with you there. Just as the Chinese grossly misunderstood the impact of the 62 war on India. They failed to understand, they consistently failed to understand the trauma it left behind in India. These are two, shall we say, different, unparalleled misunderstandings that persist in the relationship. But I think we've said enough. The floor is open to anybody who wishes to ask a question or make a very, very brief comment. Please, very brief indeed. I see one hand here. I don't know the name, but here, 2, 3 over there, and 4. And we'll stop at 4 for now and then take another round. Please, please keep it brief. And say, you are, please.
I'm Madhumita Das. I did my PhD on India-Tibet relations. It was India-Tibet relations.
Could you just stand up, please?
Do you address your question to any particular person? Okay.
I'm Madhumita Das.
We can hear you.
I teach politics at O.P. Jindal University. My question to Mr. Bhasin is, so do these documents reveal the existence of quote-unquote Tibet card? Is there a Tibet card? Does there continue to be a Tibet card? What do we Indians mean by the Tibet card? That, number one. Number two, my question is addressed to all the distinguished speakers. It seems that everyone unanimously agrees that till very recently, where our negotiators went and spoke to the Chinese counterpart, there was an absence of a red line. I would like to ask, why is this so?
Okay, we take a cluster of 4 questions together, please. The second one was, yeah, sorry. You.
Thank you, sir. This actually question is to you, sir, and perhaps to Mr. Bhasin. You mentioned about 1954, the strategy note which was prepared, and you said that there was no strategy or no perspective. I'm just wondering, of course, it can be laid at the door of the bureaucracy, which was perhaps not professional enough at that time. But there is also the question of political leadership. I guess some kind of strategy must have been thought of, let's say, at the level of the Prime Minister or the Cabinet, and as to whether there is any record as to how they were strategizing, let's say, something of this kind.
Thank you very much. The third one was there. Mr. Sharma, yes.
My question relates to a particular document that I happened to see before it went into Mr. Bhasin's volume. That was the record of discussions between Mr. Chow Lai and our Prime Minister Pandit Nehru during his last visit to India before the Chinese invasion in 1962. That document I happen to see by virtue of the fact that I sit next to him in the IIC library. He showed it to me. I didn't have a week at it without his knowledge.
To say nothing of the hours over coffee and lunch.
So, according to that document, it is a record of discussion made by the then Additional Secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs. And in that, according to that document, Mr. Chow Lai had offered a settlement over this border dispute, boundary dispute, through a kind of settlement or quid pro quo that if we let the Chinese have what they had already in their possession in the eastern sector, they were willing to allow us to have what we had, including whole of Arunachal Pradesh, in the eastern sector. Evidently, we did not take up this offer. The record is silent about what was the reaction of the Prime Minister. I would like to know from Mr. Bhasin, as well as from the luminaries of the Foreign Office who are among the discussants and chairing this discussion, as to what is it that prevented Mr. Nehru from accepting that offer. If I was a student at that time and Prime Minister had declared in the Lok Sabha that Ladakh was one region where not even a blade of grass grew. Of course, it attracted a lot of criticism and it brought a storm on his head. But what is it that prevented India and Pandit Nehru from, in your view, from taking up what in retrospect or even at that time would appear to be a very generous offer?
Yes.
Dr. Sir, I am Saurabh Dubey from ITBP, and I don't know whether this question qualifies as a question in this August presence. It's a very simple question. Pakistan ceded Shaksgam Valley to China in 1963. China had already started construction in 50s of this Western Highway in Aksai Chin, which was already with it. So what was the logic and what was the thinking of the leaders of Pakistan and China at that time, that that piece of land, the Shaksgam Valley, which is still very inhospitable, was ceded to China? What was the logic for China to ask for that piece of land from Pakistan? Question is for all of you.
Thank you. About Tibet card, I don't think there was a card, but we never used it. We felt that this relationship with the developed colonial period was not sustainable in the new circumstances, and we were more than willing to give it up and renegotiate the relationship. That's why we gave up all privileges we had in return for nothing, except that the Chinese reciprocally established trade agencies in India, which they didn't have earlier. And we surrendered everything else, the military escort, the guest houses, the telecommunication system, whatever we had. Because we found it is not a desirable sort of relationship with the British had. It was an unequal relationship. So we gave up that card, used up that card from the beginning. Now, the second question I think is not to me, but to somebody else. So I can't
Any of the other questions?
Okay. For the China, Nepal, 1960 talks. But then in this conversation with Chow Lai, when he insisted on having this area in return for eastern sector, had a personal angle. He said, I have visited this area 30 years ago, and I had also visited recently, and I didn't find any Chinese presence there. So how can you claim it to be your territory? So this was one point which was in his mind all the time, and he was not willing to concede the Chinese point that this is a area which was there from beginning. Second point, he says the road. Road is, what is road? Road is, they have only this hilly area, they have just cleared off certain boulders and the road is ready. So he was not prepared to concede that they had occupied this area for a number of years while constructing the road. For him, he just dismissed the road like anything. So that was one reason why he was not willing to surrender that. He said, this is our territory and I cannot make it. That is also in any case our territory. So he was not willing to make compromise. Problem with Pandit Nehru from the day one was that he said, this is our border and that is all. It is not open for negotiation. While he should have understood that your border is not your border alone, it's the border of another country also. Unless both the countries who are on that border agree to a particular line, it cannot be your border all by yourself. So that was the basic law in Nehru's position. And from the very beginning, he said, look, this is our border. We have announced in Parliament. Then at the end of the matter, China has no say, don't open it. We are not willing to talk about our border. Secondly, it's our failure. When we signed 1954 treaty, we had decided not to mention the border at all. We had decided. Chinese never. They said, we are treating those issues which are ripe for issue. So in their perception, border question was not ripe for discussion. So they in any case did not. So we are quite happy that this didn't come up. But within 2 months of signing this Tibetan agreement in 1954, we did not realize that China started making claims on here, there, here, everywhere. What is the game? That until April 1954, there is no claim, nothing in this sort. And in July, within 2 months, the Chinese representative comes to ministry and presents a note that you are intruding into Barahoti, which they call Buje. And then Shipila, other problems came up. We didn't realize the game. We thought these are small, probably small issues, and not a major issue, until the Konka Pass issue. And Prime Minister was happy to keep everything under wrap. He did not, for instance, in 1952, when we had moved resolution in the United Nations General Assembly on repatriation of soldiers, prisoners of war, the Chinese were very unhappy with that resolution. Though Nehru thought that this is in line with their thinking. They called Nehru's resolution 1952, mind it, that it is mother of all evils, Indian resolution. And you should have sent a letter in very undignified language for the Prime Minister. And Prime Minister kept quiet, only told the Foreign Secretary, please tell the Chinese ambassador that they should use little better language for us. And then asked Ambassador Ambassador Raghavan whether Chinese intend to give publicity to this. He said no. He said, thank God, we are not giving publicity, let it stay where it is. So with this sort of approach, what did you expect?
Any of the questions?
Well, about the 1960 offer. I think my reading is that up to the time that we formally raised the issue of the Alsatian Road, there was in fact a tacit understanding conveyed by the Chinese that they don't like the name McMahon Line, but they were willing to live with it for the sake of friendly relations between India and China. So in the earlier phase, there was no link established with Alsatian. That, according to at least some of the papers that I have seen and some material which has come out from the Chinese side, it appears that it is only in 1958 when we actually formally sent a note to China laying claim to Aksai Chin, which then would have brought the whole Aksai Chin Road therefore in question. The Chinese did not link the two aspects together. In fact, the Chinese scholar who has written about this makes this claim very explicitly, that until 1958, until this particular letter was received from the Indian side, the Chinese side did not link the West and the East in the package proposal. It is only because when this was raised, how could China accept the alignment of the McMahon line, because then there would be no bargaining counter. But the Chinese side was putting it as a bargaining counter, but the Indian side misunderstood. And there was, it all then led to 1962. Now here the issue is that, and the letters of Prime Minister Nehru that I came across in Rangoon, those letters written to UNO, where he was advising UNO that they don't use the word McMahon, but the Chinese seem to be quite ready to live with that alignment. But there are these connotations about imperialism, and why should we, in fact, use such terms? So his advice to UNO was that we could perhaps settle on this basis. In none of the letters which are from 1958 and then 59 is there any mention of the Western sector at all. So it is only after this letter is issued that actually the Western sector comes into salience. Now, I think by the time that by the time Chow Enlai came to Delhi, India had already taken a formal position with respect to its claim on Aksai Chin. So it would have been very difficult to then suggest that somehow this package proposal was acceptable. I mean, it is a fact that we took a very legalistic position, whereas this was essentially a political situation that needed a political solution to, not a legal. I mean, you may have all the legal arguments on your side, but that doesn't help in resolving what is essentially a political issue. Let me say this, however, that I do not think there are two problems that I find. One is that because we lost 1962, therefore we believe that Chinese claims stand validated. There is no such thing. And merely because India lost doesn't mean that therefore, as a result, the Chinese claims to the territories on our borders are actually valid. They are not. Until even the Qing dynasty, which was the period of the maximum extent of the Chinese empire, the southernmost frontier of China did not extend south of the Kunlun Mountains. If you look at the Qing dynasty maps, that is where China's borders are shown. So it is not that, okay, India did not have perhaps the best claims possible on Aksai Chin, but that does not therefore equal to better claims by China on Aksai Chin. That a certain reality came about as a result of what China did in building the road and the compulsion at that time to have this access to Tibet through Xinjiang. That's a separate issue. But I don't think we should fall into the trap of thinking that, because so many people have shown that the Indian claim to Aksai Chin is perhaps not as solid as we believe it was, and therefore it means that the Chinese have better. That's not true.
So this is one single point. But shouldn't we have from the beginning agreed to discuss the border which was not delineated, not marked?
Yeah, that's a separate issue. I mean, that's I'm not. It's very. It's. We have 2020 vision for whatever happened before. I think we have to be a little careful. We don't know all the compulsions at work, at that particular point of time. But yes, I think as I said myself that. We should have looked at this issue more from the political angle rather than be stuck in the legalities, what we believed were the legalities of the issue, which was not really the point.
But I think, just to add to this, the problem why we didn't accept the package, which by the way the Chinese records now say they never offered, they deny that they offered it, so it's not on offer anymore. But quite apart from that, the reason I think that we didn't accept the package was that it was politically impossible for an Indian leader in that situation in 19 to think of this. The first time the full extent of Chinese claims are known to you is January 1959. March, the Dalai Lama comes. You have Tibetan refugees pouring in. And this is within well, a couple of years of Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, of everything being kept under wraps before that, for Indian public opinion, for Parliament, for the opposition, for everyone, for the media, this is a huge issue. That China's betrayed you, China's behaving badly in Tibet. No leader in India at that stage, after having taken the position in public that our boundaries are settled, there's nothing here to discuss, after that it was almost impossible. But what Nehru did was, he thought that he would show Joe the limits of what he could do by sending him to meet all the major ministers. Govind Ballabh, Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, you name it. I mean, he sent him on a tour of all the ministers, Morarji, and the records are in this book. And it's very sad reading, because I think certainly they convinced Zhou Enlai that there was no give in the Indian position. But they probably also convinced him that there's not much point negotiating with these guys. Which is not the right message to leave them, but what does it leave them with as options? But that record is in the book and it's worth reading, those records of why. So for me, there was only so much political space domestically for that. Now, whether it would have worked, whether all that is what ifs. I don't think that's. Why did the Chinese want Shaksgam? Partly because it also buttressed their claim that the Karakoram watershed was the boundary. But also because they were in quite a bind in Xinjiang. 60,000 Kazakhs and Uyghurs had actually left Xinjiang earlier in 1962. And the Chinese were blaming the Soviets, by the way. Many of them came to us, came and settled in India also, some of the Uyghurs and Kazakhs, and then went on to other countries. They had unrest not just in Tibet, they had unrest in Xinjiang, and they didn't want to have on what they regarded as their side of the watershed a pocket which was outside their control, and the Pakistanis were in no position to control it. So it actually made sense for them to actually take it over as quickly as they could and to isolate it. You notice what they did? They didn't actually station troops in Shaksgam immediately in 63, in March, after the agreement. All they did was to isolate it and cut it off from everybody else and to make sure that nobody could use it against them. So, did we not have any red lines at all? No, we had red lines, but they were red lines which didn't allow us to really negotiate. I mean, you didn't have territory to negotiate. What were you going to negotiate on the boundaries? So we had very clear red lines after 62, but those red lines were very high, and they didn't actually permit a meaningful negotiation until much later, until you came to an understanding with the Chinese in the Rajiv Gandhi visit that only adjustments are possible. Because that's all that's allowed under your law, under what the Supreme Court said, in Berubari, etc. So, if you're discussing adjustments, that you can do. And that is probably the only way forward. But we did have red lines. I mean, I think it's unfair to say, oh, we just were clueless and we had no idea what we were doing. That's really
just 1 second. To respond to Yogi's point, Yogi put a very specific question to me about the political discussions. If you look at the correspondence between Panditji and his ministers, including Sardar Patel, but there are other ministers who also correspond to the materials included here. Panditji's process was totally non-collegial. He basically says that, yes, I will talk about this to Tibet, and that's it. There was no serious internal discussions in the cabinet at all. One other small point I want to add, which is that, it's not a small point, that having embarked on the position that our borders were what we said they were in 1952, we closed the door to any discussion. It may surprise some that we seriously considered, in fact it was virtually a decision, that if the Chinese side raised the border in the 54 talks, we would withdraw from the negotiations. That is how sure we were in our position, that by sticking to the position that there is nothing to discuss, the problem went away. This illusion endured with us for a long, long time. It stretched. Nobody knows. I mean, when Jagat Mehta convinces Panditji after the 5th round of discussions, before the final round, to change the word border dispute to border question. And it's there in Jagat's book. This is not a piece of fiction on my part. Jagat believes this is a major victory that he won. And he feels that it is the right of a middle-ranking official to take up with his Prime Minister an issue like this. But it was really our sense of the public perception to which I have mentioned, which comes through all around. We first took a position, that position shaped an Indian perception, and then we became prisoners of that perception. Collection of documents like this has to be seen in context. And of course, no collection of documents will tell you the entire story. It only tells you a certain portion of the Indian story, and nothing more than that. And as Shankar says, the documents only tell you a certain percentage of the story in any case. Many other things are not captured. I think it remains only for me to thank you very warmly, all of you, for joining this discussion, for your contributions, your participation. We really did run out of time, and we could have gone on maybe for an hour longer. Maybe the audience might have thinned out a little bit, and maybe some speakers would have left. And Sham, I know, is anxious to leave. So let me conclude by thanking very warmly both Ambassador Sham Saran and Ambassador Shivshankar Menon for the erudition that they have brought to today's discussion. Bhasin Saab, above all, for the monumental work he has done, for his comments, his observations, his rich introduction, which has absorbed all the material that he has grasped, and of course, ICWA and the Institute of Chinese Studies. Thank you very much.